The Apache warrior's blood was still warm when it splattered across Sarah Mitchell's white cotton dress, but the 3 rifle shots that had echoed across the Arizona desert moments before told her this was no ordinary morning in September 1882. She had been hanging laundry behind her isolated homestead when the desperate figure stumbled from the rocky outcropping, clutching his shoulder as crimson seeped between his fingers. What made her freeze wasn't the sight of blood or even the traditional Apache clothing that marked him as one of the feared warriors the cavalry had been hunting for months. It was the leather pouch he pressed into her trembling hands before collapsing at her feet, whispering words in English that would haunt her for the rest of her days. The children, Hidden Canyon, 3 days. His dark eyes, glazed with pain and fever, locked onto hers with an intensity that seemed to pierce straight through to her soul. Promise me. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she glanced toward the distant dust cloud approaching from the east, knowing it meant soldiers were closing in fast. Her husband Thomas had been gone for 4 days now, supposedly selling cattle in Tombstone, though she had begun to suspect his frequent absences involved more than livestock trading. Their 7-year-old daughter Emma was inside the cabin, hopefully still asleep and unaware that her mother now held the life of an Apache warrior in her hands. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to let the cavalry find him here. After all, wasn't this exactly what the military had warned all the settlers about? Hadn't they been told repeatedly that showing mercy to hostile Indians would only bring death and destruction to their families? But something in the warrior's eyes spoke of a desperation that went far beyond his own survival, something that made Sarah's maternal instincts override every lesson about frontier survival she had learned during her 5 brutal years in Apache territory. The leather pouch felt surprisingly heavy in her palm, and when she loosened the drawstring, her breath caught in her throat. Inside were 3 small items that changed everything she thought she knew about the conflict raging around her isolated homestead. A child's wooden doll, carved with the same skilled craftsmanship she had seen in Emma's favorite toy. A strand of blonde hair, so light it was almost white, braided with traditional Apache beadwork. And most disturbing of all, a small silver locket that she recognized immediately because she had seen its twin hanging around the neck of Margaret Harrison just 3 weeks ago at the church social in town. The approaching thunder of horses' hooves gave her perhaps minutes to make a decision that would either save lives or destroy her own family. Sarah looked down at the unconscious Apache, noting details she had been too shocked to register before. He was younger than she had initially thought, probably no more than 25, with a lean but powerful build that spoke of a life lived entirely in the harsh desert wilderness. More importantly, she could see now that he had been shot not once but twice, with what appeared to be an older wound in his thigh that had been crudely bandaged with strips of fabric that looked suspiciously like it had been torn from a woman's dress. The pattern was floral, delicate, nothing that would have come from Apache clothing. "Emma, stay inside and don't come out no matter what you hear," Sarah called toward the cabin, her voice steadier than she felt. She grabbed the Apache under his arms and began dragging him toward the small root cellar behind their home, a space she had originally intended for storing vegetables but which now seemed like the only place that might keep them both alive. The man was heavier than she had expected, and by the time she managed to get him down the narrow wooden steps and onto the earthen floor, her dress was soaked with both his blood and her own sweat. The sound of the approaching cavalry grew louder, close enough now that she could make out individual voices shouting orders to fan out and search every building, every hiding place, every possible refuge where a wounded Apache might seek shelter. Sarah climbed back up from the cellar and threw an old blanket over the entrance, then scattered some of Emma's toys and a few kitchen utensils on top to make it look like nothing more than a storage area that hadn't been disturbed in months. Her hands were shaking so violently that she could barely manage to wipe the blood from her dress with a damp cloth, though the stains had already set too deeply to be completely removed. Lieutenant Morrison and 6 cavalry soldiers rode into her yard with the confident brutality of men who had been hunting Apache for so long that they had forgotten these were human beings they were pursuing rather than dangerous animals. Morrison himself was a tall, lean man with cold blue eyes and the kind of mustache that suggested he took great pride in his appearance even in the middle of the wilderness. Sarah had met him twice before, once when he had questioned her about suspicious Apache activity in the area, and once when he had made suggestions about her personal safety that had made her deeply uncomfortable given that her husband was frequently absent. "Mrs. Mitchell," Morrison called out as he dismounted, his gaze already scanning the property with the practiced eye of a predator. "We're tracking a wounded hostile who was seen heading in this direction." Have you noticed anything unusual this morning? Any signs that someone might have been on your property? Sarah forced herself to meet his gaze directly, knowing that any sign of nervousness or deception could prove fatal not only for the Apache hiding beneath her feet but potentially for Emma as well. She had heard too many stories about what happened to settlers who were suspected of aiding hostile Indians, and she knew that Morrison's definition of justice often involved first shooting and asking questions later. The leather pouch felt like it was burning against her hip where she had hidden it in the folds of her dress, and she had to resist the urge to touch it to make sure it was still concealed. "I've been doing laundry since sunrise, Lieutenant," she replied, gesturing toward the clothesline where wet sheets and Emma's small dresses fluttered in the desert breeze. "Haven't seen or heard anything unusual, though I did hear some gunshots maybe an hour ago, seemed to come from somewhere up in the rocks to the north." Morrison's eyes narrowed as he studied her face, and Sarah could feel him looking for any crack in her composure, any sign that she might be lying. Behind him, the other soldiers had begun searching the barn, the chicken coop, and the small shed where Thomas kept his tools, their movements efficient and thorough in a way that suggested they had done this many times before. One of them, a younger man with sergeant's stripes, approached the area near the root cellar, and Sarah's heart nearly stopped beating entirely. "This Apache we're hunting isn't just any warrior, Mrs. Mitchell," Morrison continued, his voice taking on a tone that seemed almost conversational but carried an underlying threat that made Sarah's skin crawl. "He's been involved in activities that go far beyond the usual raids and cattle theft. We have reason to believe he's been taking captives, white captives, and holding them in some hidden location where we haven't been able to find them." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, and suddenly the contents of the leather pouch made a horrible kind of sense. The blonde hair, the locket, the child's doll, all of these were not trophies taken from victims but desperate attempts at communication from people who were still alive somewhere, people who needed help that only someone who knew their location could provide. The Apache warrior hadn't stumbled onto her property by accident or even seeking medical attention for his wounds. He had come here specifically, deliberately, because somehow he knew she might be the one person in the territory willing to risk everything to save innocent lives. "That's terrible, Lieutenant," Sarah managed to say, though her voice sounded strange and distant even to her own ears. "I certainly hope you find him soon. A man like that shouldn't be allowed to roam free in country where there are families with children." Morrison nodded approvingly at her response, but his attention was now focused on the sergeant who was examining the ground near the concealed cellar entrance. Sarah could see that the soldier had noticed the disturbed earth where she had dragged the Apache's body, and she realized with growing horror that there were probably blood drops leading directly to the spot where she had hidden him. Time seemed to slow down as the sergeant knelt down and brushed away some of the scattered toys, revealing the edge of the blanket that covered the cellar opening. "Lieutenant," the sergeant called out, his voice carrying the excitement of a man who believed he was about to make an important discovery. "I think you need to see this." Sarah's mind raced through a dozen desperate explanations as the sergeant's gloved hand reached for the blanket covering the root cellar, but it was 7-year-old Emma who saved them all by choosing that exact moment to disobey her mother's instructions and burst through the cabin door. The child ran straight toward the group of soldiers with the fearless curiosity that only children possess, her blonde pigtails bouncing as she clutched her favorite rag doll against her chest. "Mama, why are all these men here?" Emma asked loudly, her innocent question causing every soldier in the yard to turn their attention toward her rather than the disturbed ground beneath their feet. "Are they here to buy some of Papa's horses? Papa said he was going to sell horses but he's been gone for so long I thought maybe he forgot the way home." Lieutenant Morrison's stern expression softened slightly as he looked down at the child, though Sarah noticed his eyes lingering on Emma's blonde hair in a way that made her stomach clench with fear. The resemblance between her daughter's hair and the braided strand hidden in the leather pouch was unmistakable, and Sarah realized with growing dread that Morrison might be making the same connection. She quickly moved to place herself between the lieutenant and Emma, scooping the child up in her arms with a forced smile that she hoped looked more natural than it felt. "The soldiers are just looking for some bad man who might be hiding in the area, sweetheart," Sarah explained, her voice carefully controlled despite the terror coursing through her veins. "They'll be leaving soon, and then we can go back to our morning chores." She looked directly at Morrison as she spoke, silently challenging him to contradict her in front of a child, knowing that even hardened cavalry officers typically maintain some degree of decorum around innocent children. The sergeant had paused in his investigation when Emma appeared, but now he was looking back and forth between the child's hair and something he had apparently noticed on the ground. Sarah could see him processing information, making connections that could prove fatal for everyone involved. She needed to create a distraction, something that would draw attention away from the concealed cellar entrance before the sergeant could examine it more closely. "Lieutenant Morrison," Sarah said suddenly, her voice taking on a tone of concerned helpfulness. "I just remembered something that might be important. Yesterday evening, just before sunset, I thought I heard voices coming from the direction of Devil's Canyon, maybe 2 or 3 miles northeast of here. It sounded like people arguing, but it was too far away for me to make out any words. Could that have been the men you're looking for?" Morrison's attention immediately focused on her with laser-like intensity, and Sarah could see him weighing her words, trying to determine whether she was telling the truth or attempting to mislead him. Devil's Canyon was notorious throughout the territory as a place where Apache warriors had successfully evaded capture multiple times, its maze of narrow passages and hidden caves providing perfect concealment for anyone who knew how to navigate its treacherous terrain. "What time exactly did you hear these voices, Mrs. Mitchell?" Morrison asked, his tone suggesting that her answer might determine whether she lived or died. "And are you certain they came from the direction of Devil's Canyon rather than somewhere closer to your property?" Sarah forced herself to appear thoughtful, as if she was carefully recalling details rather than desperately fabricating a story that might save 3 lives. "It must have been around 6:30 or 7 o'clock, just when I was bringing the chickens in for the night. The sound carried on the wind. You know how voices can travel across the desert in the evening when the air is still. I didn't think much of it at the time because we occasionally hear travelers passing through, but now that you mention Apache raiders, well, it does seem like something you should know about." The lieutenant studied her face for what felt like an eternity, his cold blue eyes searching for any sign of deception. Behind him, Sarah could see that the sergeant had stepped away from the cellar area and was now examining the tracks left by the cavalry horses, apparently having been distracted from his earlier discovery by the conversation about Devil's Canyon. Emma had grown restless in her mother's arms and was now squirming to be put down, her child's attention already moving on to other interests. "Sergeant Williams," Morrison called out suddenly, making Sarah's heart skip a beat. "Mount up. We're heading to Devil's Canyon. If there are hostiles hiding in that area, we need to flush them out before they have a chance to escape deeper into the mountains." He turned back to Sarah with an expression that was both grateful and suspicious. "Thank you for the information, Mrs. Mitchell. If you see or hear anything else unusual, anything at all, you send Emma here to find the nearest patrol immediately. We can't afford to let dangerous men roam free in country where there are women and children." As the soldiers prepared to leave, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and growing dread. She had successfully prevented them from discovering the wounded Apache, but she knew this was only a temporary reprieve. Morrison was too experienced and too suspicious to be fooled for long, and when he failed to find any trace of hostile activity at Devil's Canyon, he would almost certainly return to search her property more thoroughly. More importantly, she still had no idea what to do about the Apache warrior hidden beneath her feet, or about the horrifying implications of the items he had given her. The sound of horses' hooves gradually faded into the distance, but Sarah remained motionless in her yard for several more minutes, listening carefully to make sure the soldiers were truly gone before she dared to move. Emma had wandered off to play with the chickens, her child's world already returned to normal, but Sarah's life had been irrevocably changed in the span of a single morning. She waited until she was certain they were alone before carefully moving the toys and kitchen utensils away from the cellar entrance and pulling back the concealing blanket. The Apache warrior was exactly where she had left him, unconscious and barely breathing, his bronzed skin now pale with blood loss and fever. Sarah climbed down into the small earthen space and knelt beside him, placing her hand on his forehead to check his temperature. He was burning with fever, and she could see that both of his wounds had started bleeding again during the time he had been hidden in the cellar. If she was going to keep him alive long enough to discover the truth about those children, she needed to act quickly. Sarah had learned basic medical skills from her mother, who had served as the closest thing to a doctor in their small farming community back in Missouri, but treating gunshot wounds was far beyond anything she had ever attempted. She climbed back up to gather supplies, returning with clean cloths, a bottle of whiskey that Thomas kept hidden behind the flour barrel, needle and thread, and a sharp knife that she had sterilized in boiling water. The warrior stirred slightly as she began cleaning his wounds, his dark eyes opening briefly to focus on her face with a mixture of confusion and wariness. "You're safe," Sarah whispered, not knowing whether he could understand English but hoping that her tone would convey her peaceful intentions. "The soldiers are gone, but you're badly hurt. I need to clean these wounds or you're going to die from infection." She showed him the bottle of whiskey and the needle, trying to mime what she intended to do. "This is going to hurt, but it's necessary." To her surprise, the Apache warrior nodded slightly and reached into his clothing with his uninjured arm, producing a small leather pouch containing what appeared to be herbs and powdered medicines. He pointed first to the pouch and then to his wounds, clearly indicating that he had his own medical supplies that might be more effective than her crude frontier remedies. Sarah carefully examined the contents of the pouch, recognizing some plants that she knew were used for pain relief and infection prevention, though others were completely unfamiliar to her. Working together in silence, they managed to clean and properly dress both of his wounds, the Apache warrior remaining conscious throughout the painful process though sweat beaded on his forehead and his jaw was clenched tight with the effort of not crying out. When they were finished, he looked directly into Sarah's eyes and spoke in carefully pronounced English, his voice weak but determined. "My name is Nailnish," he said, the Apache words flowing like water over stone. "In your language, it means, he works. I am not what your people believe me to be." He paused to catch his breath, clearly struggling with both pain and the effort of communicating in a foreign language. "The children your soldiers seek, they are not captives. They are refugees, hiding from men who would kill them for what they have seen." Sarah's hand stilled on the bandages as the full implication of his words hit her. "What do you mean, refugees? What have they seen that would put them in danger?" She pulled the leather pouch from her dress and showed him the contents. "These things you gave me, they belong to children who have been reported missing. The whole territory has been searching for them, assuming they were taken by Apache raiders." Nailnish struggled to sit up straighter, his eyes focusing intently on the items in Sarah's hands. "The white woman, Margaret Harrison, she discovered something terrible about the men who run the silver mine near Tucson. She learned that they were using Apache prisoners as slave labor, working them to death in the deepest tunnels where no inspector would ever see. When she tried to report this to the authorities, she discovered that some of the military officers were involved in the conspiracy, taking money to provide workers and to keep the truth hidden." The words hit Sarah like physical blows, each revelation more horrifying than the last. She thought of Lieutenant Morrison's cold eyes, his frequent patrols in areas where Apache had been captured, his questions about her husband's frequent absences that now seemed more sinister than suspicious. Margaret Harrison disappeared 3 weeks ago. Everyone assumed she had been killed by raiders. Are you telling me she's still alive? She and her children are hidden in a place my people have used for many generations when the white soldiers hunt us, Nailnish continued, his voice growing weaker with the effort of speaking. But the men who want her dead are getting closer. They know she has evidence that could destroy them, documents that prove which officials are involved and how much money has been paid to keep the slave operation secret. That is why I came to find you, Sarah Mitchell. Your husband Thomas is one of the few white men who has shown honor in his dealings with my people. We hoped you would have the same courage. Sarah's world tilted on its axis as she processed this information. Thomas's frequent absences, his mysterious cattle-selling trips that never seemed to bring much money, his careful questions about her opinions on the Apache conflicts, suddenly everything made a different kind of sense. Her husband had been involved in some kind of underground effort to help Apache prisoners, and somehow word of this had reached Nailnish and his people. But now both Margaret Harrison and her children were in deadly danger, hidden somewhere in the wilderness with evidence that could expose a conspiracy involving both civilian businessmen and military officers. How many children are with Margaret? Sarah asked, her mind already working through the implications and the dangers involved in any rescue attempt. 3, Nailnish replied, his eyes beginning to close with exhaustion and pain. Her own daughter Rebecca, age 9, and 2 Apache children whose parents were killed in the mine. The little ones have been separated from their people for so long they speak only English now, but they remember everything they saw in those tunnels. They are witnesses to murder, Sarah Mitchell. If the men behind this conspiracy find them, they will all die, not just to keep their secrets but to send a message to anyone else who might think of exposing the truth. Sarah sat back on her heels in the cramped cellar, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was being asked to do. Harboring a wounded Apache was dangerous enough, but actively participating in a rescue mission that involved taking on corrupt military officers and wealthy mine owners was essentially a death sentence for her entire family. Yet as she looked at the items from the leather pouch, especially the child's wooden doll that was so similar to Emma's favorite toy, she knew she could not abandon innocent children to save her own safety. "Where are they hidden?" she asked quietly, already knowing that asking the question meant she had made her decision. Nailnish managed a weak smile before his eyes closed completely. 3 days' ride north, in the place my people call the Canyon of Echoing Voices. But the way is dangerous, and the men hunting them have Apache trackers working for them now, Apache who have been forced to choose between betraying their own people and watching their families starve. You will need help, Sarah Mitchell. You will need your husband, and you will need others who understand that some things are worth dying for. As Nailnish fell unconscious again, Sarah climbed out of the cellar with her mind spinning through plans and possibilities. She had perhaps 6 days before Thomas was supposed to return from Tombstone, 6 days to somehow get word to him about what was happening, 6 days to figure out how to mount a rescue mission that could save 4 innocent lives while avoiding the corrupt officials and Apache trackers who were hunting them. 6 days to decide whether she was brave enough to risk everything she had built in the Arizona territory for people she had never met, guided only by the word of an Apache warrior who might himself be part of some elaborate deception. But as Emma's laughter drifted across the yard from where she was playing with the chickens, Sarah knew that the choice had already been made. If there were children hiding in the wilderness, children whose only crime was witnessing the brutal truth about how some white men treated Apache prisoners, then she would find a way to save them, no matter what the cost. The question was not whether she would act, but whether she could figure out how to act quickly enough and cleverly enough to outsmart men who had been perfecting their deadly conspiracy for months or possibly years.